Welcome back to another episode of Harry's Take. After a short summer break, I am delighted to be back on the air hosting another episode. Today, we are going to be talking about a difficult but important topic, the Holocaust. I have the pleasure of welcoming Ellen Kaidanow and both of her in laws, Ellen and Jerry Kaidanow, on the show to share their stories of surviving the Holocaust. Ellen, the daughter in law, is very involved in Holocaust education through the Holocaust and Human Rights Center in White Plains, New York, where her husband, Joseph, is the chairperson emeritus. Let's start with you, Ellen, daughter in law. I know it is difficult to condense the stories, but could you give a brief overview of each of your in law's stories so that our viewers have background?
Sure. Thank you for having us, Terry. So, my mother in law, who we share the same name, is also Ellen Kaidanow, was born in a tiny little town in Poland called Dubno. That town is now part of Ukraine because the borders change back and forth. And she was very young when the Holocaust began. And her parents owned a beautiful house across the street from a park where she played. She had two older sister and a younger sister, and they were actually the parents ran a candy store and everything was good. But at a certain point, the Germans, the Nazis, came to their town, and their family had to go live in a Jewish ghetto. And Ellen was only about 5 years old when this happened. She was just about to start kindergarten. And their family had a nanny and a slash housekeeper because the parents worked every day in the candy store. So she took care of the girls. And at one point, she told my mother in law's parents that she could take one child and hide her. Her name was Lena, and she was a Christian woman. And so she did not have to go to the ghetto. So what happened is, after almost a year of being in the ghetto, the rumor was there was going to be one last action, they used to call it, and all the Jews in the ghetto would be killed. And so my mother-in-law was basically handed over to Lena at the gate of the ghetto. And she survived by Lena telling everyone that it was her illegitimate child. And Lena hid her. She was not married at the time, but she had a large family, and she moved my mother-in-law around to her siblings who lived on different farms. And she would hide behind the stove, and she would, hid. And for a couple of years, that's what happened. And what she also had an aunt and uncle that had lived in her hometown. And that aunt and uncle had actually stopped by her house and begged her parents to leave and come with them. They were going to go to Russia. They heard something bad was going to be happening to the Jews, and they wanted to get out of town. But her parents wouldn't leave because they had a good life there, and they had no idea what was about to happen. They couldn't even imagine what was about to happen. But that aunt that had fled to Russia with her husband, and they had a young son, came back to look for my mother-in-law once the war was ending. And she traveled 1,000 miles from Russia to get back to Dubno, found Ellen, and wanted to take her back with her and eventually bring her to the United States. The problem was that my mother-in-law did not want to leave Lena because by now Lena was like a mother to her. She loved her
Mhm.
before the war started. She saved her. She survived with her, and she was really like her mother, and she didn't want to go. So it was excruciating difficult for her to be torn away. But Lena didn't want to let her go either, but knew she would have a much better life in the United States than in this tiny town. So the bottom line is she let her go. And then her aunt, her uncle, and her cousin all eventually made their way to a displaced persons camp in Germany when the war ended. They lived there for a while, and the aunt and uncle desperately wanted to get their son and my mother-in-law out of Europe because Jews were still afraid. Even though the Holocaust had ended, they were still very afraid that there were still bad things going on. They heard that there was an orphanage next door in Germany that was successfully taking boatloads of children and getting them to the United States. So my mother-in-law was an orphan. I forgot to mention a very important part. Her entire family was killed in the ghetto. So while Lena was hiding her mother, her father, both of her sisters, grandmother, the extended family gone. So she's the sole survivor of her family at age 5 or 6. Yes. So now Zhenya and Reuben, the aunt and uncle, hear that this orphanage is getting these children out. And so the aunt and uncle lie and they say that both my mother-in-law and their son are orphans, when really only my mother-in-law was the orphan. But they said that their son was too, and they got them
Mhm.
into the orphanage, and they both lived in that orphanage, the kids, for 1 year. And at the end of that year, they were put on a boat and they sailed across the world to the United States on their own. And
Wow.
my mother-in-law always says how seasick she was, and she finally felt better when she finally saw the Statue of Liberty. And then they stayed here in the States. They eventually lived with the aunt and uncle, got over 8 months later, and they lived with them in the Bronx. And then she met my father-in-law, and they ended up living in New Rochelle. They have 3 wonderful children, and they've had a great life. But we can get into this later, but the Holocaust never leaves you. So you can have a great life, but damage is done, and that's something we can talk about. But it's an
Mhm.
amazing story, and that's basically her background.
Thank you so much for that.
So my father-in-law was born in 1933, and he lived in a small town in Poland called Krowice, and that's now in Belarus, actually. And both of his parents were killed in 1942 during, again, what they call an action, when the Nazis would just come into a town and they would kill all of the Jews. Um,
Mhm.
it's a very sad story, but a typical story. The Nazis many times would come into a town in the morning. They would round up all the men, and they would take them and kill them. And then they would come back looking for other people. And that's what happened. His father was killed, and then they came back and they found his mother. And unfortunately, she was also killed. My father in law has one brother. They were hiding in the house after the father, left in the morning. The mom said, "I want you to hide." And they hid in a little chicken coop outside of the house. And they were lucky. They weren't found. And um, after that, they went to a neighboring town, the two brothers, and they found that they had an aunt that was there and her sister was there. And they ended up going into the Narosh forest, which is in Poland. And this group hid in the forest for several years until the war had ended. And they
Wow.
helped, I know, and they helped what were called the partisans, which were a group of people who were fighting against the Nazis. Now, my father in law was only 9 years old when his parents were killed and when they started to go into the forest with his older brother and the relatives. So he was the youngest of the group, but he was extremely brave, and he
Mhm.
had an excellent sense of direction, which he still has now. And he would help lead the partisan fighters and other people around the forest to navigate the forest. And at night, in order to get food to survive in the forest, my father-in-law was a little kid, so they took him out. And what happened? People who lived in the surrounding towns, a lot of them, they buried their meat and their potatoes in the ground. It was like a form of refrigeration. And so
Mhm.
they would dig up and try and find food that they could take back to the forest. And one night, my father in law was down digging up and he came across a dead body. And it was the body of one of the Nazi fighters that the townspeople had killed and buried there. So these are wild stories. He's only a little boy. He could be only 10 years old when this happened. He would go door to
Mhm.
door and ask for bread. Some people would give. So unbelievable stories. Eventually, the same story, he gets to the United States and, he meets my mother in law. But the beginning of both of their lives was horrific. And the fact that they are as together as they are and, have had to, survive all these memories all these years is incredible. They're both incredible people.
Thank you so much, Ellen, for those really moving stories. I can't even imagine what it was like. But let's turn to Jerry. Welcome to the show, Jerry. Thank you so much for being on with me today. And I want to just ask, looking back on your experience as a little boy, what would you say was the most important quality or qualities that helped you survive during that horrific time in your life?
I was very young, but I had a sense of orientation. So when
Mm-hmm.
partisans had to go somewhere, I would go in front of them and lead them to where they have to go, and then they would give us food instead of that. But basically, I was a good survivor because A, I was too young to understand the whole thing, and B, I had to be on my own. There's
Mm-hmm.
no choice. And here we are, several years later. We're married, we have wonderful children, we have wonderful grandchildren.
Hmm. Yeah. He was very brave.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing, Jerry. Uh, yeah, the orientation is very important, especially in the forest that you're trying to escape people. But uh, Ellen, the mother-in-law, can we? I want to ask you. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Also, I want to ask you, what lessons did you learn from that terrifying experience that really stuck with you and that you want to share today to our audience?
Well, I think the most important lesson was that I was very fortunate to meet up with very kind and wonderful people that helped me to go along. And the
Mm-hmm.
rest of it, you sort of uh, do what you have to do. You know, I
Mm-hmm.
wasn't old enough to make my own decisions, so my decisions always came through somebody else. If my aunt said we're going to Germany, we went to Germany. She said we're going to the United States, we came to the United States. And I think in the United States, I finally started to realize that I can do things on my own. I can go to school, I can learn. I
Mm-hmm.
graduated Taft High School, and I continued my life. But what happened to me all along before that never left me. It's always been with me, and it always sort of dampened my good days and my happy days because I never forgot the bad days.
Thank you so much for sharing. And I want to ask both of you actually. I know it's very hard for those memories to leave your mind, especially in these happy days that you're living now. How do you cope with those memories in your day to day life now when a bad thought comes up and you want to try to move on and enjoy the day? What methods do you use to try to cope with those thoughts?
Well, I guess you just learn that not always everything goes your way. And so you have to accept sometimes the knocks in your life, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and just try to do the best and go on.
Be grateful for what you have.
Thank you.
And I'll second what she said, and I always refer to my wife for better stories of our lives. A, we got married, we have beautiful children, we have beautiful grandchildren, and life goes on.
Thank you, Jerry. Um, and turn back to Ellen. Daughter-in-law. I know that we know the Holocaust was a long time ago, but there's still a lot of signs of anti-Semitism and the same type of persecution that Jews in Israel and around the world are still facing. So I know you're very involved in Holocaust education and with these groups that educate people and the importance of survivor stories, such as your in-laws that we're getting the pleasure of talking to today. But I want to ask you, after October 7th and everything that's happened with anti Semitism, how would you say the role of Holocaust education has changed or become even more important after the attack on Israel?
Well, it's absolutely the most important thing that can happen now, but not only now, forever. And part of the problem is there are many states in our country that do not have Holocaust education. There are lots of young people that don't even know what the Holocaust is. And that's partly why my mother and father in law and I go out and speak to students, usually middle school and high school students, entire schools at a time. And I really, a lot of times, will try and speak in schools recently that are not Jewish schools so that people can understand, because the lessons of a Holocaust story are desperately needed, and what we all need to do, which is to accept other people who are not like us, to get to know people that aren't like us, and to understand that really inside we're all the same, and that
Mhm.
we have to we can't just tolerate other people. We need to celebrate the differences in each other, and that that is the most important, and be grateful for what we do have. Most of the time we don't appreciate basic things. If you have a mom or a dad, if you have brothers and sisters, if you have a roof over your head, if you have food on the table, if you go to school, if you have an education, these are all things that were taken away from Jewish people during the Holocaust. So even if you thought about that every day and you woke up and were just grateful for the basic things, that's why hearing a Holocaust story or understanding what happened during the Holocaust will help you be grateful for your own life.
Thank you so much, Ellen. And I know the work that you all are doing is so important, and I'm grateful to for you guys to speak at my school. And I think this year we're hoping to get another session. So thank you all so much for coming on the show, and Jerry, Ellen, and Ellen. Uh, I just want to thank you guys again, and as always, thank you for tuning in to Harry's Take. What's your take?